Hello there, and welcome along to which is already astonishingly enough episode 9 of the Gardener Ben podcast. I hope that you've enjoyed the podcast so far and have been following along on my other social media channels. I want to personally thank all of the guests so far and to let you know that next week I'm going to be joined by a very special guest indeed. Next week I'm going to be talking to Liam, David Austin Rose's senior rose consultant. I caught up with him just a week or two ago when I went up to the David Austin nursery to participate in one of their bare root rose courses. You can hear the chat I had with him next week in episode 10. However, today's episode is all about the garden in the autumn and winter. And as a social media content creator, my inbox is already filling up with people messaging about when they can start pruning and cutting back and putting the garden to rest for the winter. And on this particular subject, I'm going to ask you to exercise a little bit of caution and a little bit of self-control. And if you can, to just allow the garden to rest and enter into that wonderful quiet period of time. Allow the leaves to drop and the colours to slowly fade before heading out and doing any major works. The garden, just like its gardener, needs to take a breath, relax and just enjoy the season that's coming in. Allow the weather to take its toll. Allow the colours to fade and the garden to enter that wonderful skeletal stage where all you see is the framework of things before doing any major works. I assure you there is beauty to be found in the garden during the autumn and winter months. Although you need to keep the leaves cleared from your lawns and get them onto the compost heap, I tend to blow mine mostly into the borders and allow them there to compost before mulching over them in the weeks and months to come. I leave all of my herbaceous perennials standing in the garden until at least the end of January, allowing the colour to completely fade and them to start breaking down where they stand. It's really enjoyable to watch the smaller birds in the garden feast upon their seed heads, slowly working their way up and down the stems, feasting on the seeds and other beasties and creepy crawlies enjoying them as well. The garden is visited by everybody, from blue tits to wrens, bullfinches and even goldfinches who love to feast on the seeds at this time of year. This works quite nicely because what I normally do is clear the borders back in late January before giving them a thoroughly good weed. Everything is then at a pretty reduced state so I can get into the borders and start my rose pruning, normally through the months of February and March. Leaving the borders completely clear, the roses pruned and everybody ready for mulching for the season ahead, normally bang on cue for around March and April time. I'm going to be talking to you extensively about mulches in the coming minutes, so let's get into that subject now. I've talked about the subject of mulches on many occasions on social media, and it seems to be something that confuses many gardeners, both old and new. The term mulch can basically mean anything that's applied to the soil surface, whether it's organic or whether it's permanent. A top dressing of something just to protect the soil surface from the elements, whether that be the heat, whether that be water, or whether that be the sun. Obviously, a permanent mulch can take the form of gravel, chippings or stone, and an organic mulch can take the form of pretty much anything, all the way from homemade garden compost, leaf mulch, well-rotted horse or cow manure, wood chip or bark, along with other products like soil conditioners, which I use in very large quantities in the garden. Now, depending on your garden and soil needs, you need to choose the mulch that's correct for you. If you're moving into a new build garden, or you're unsure of how the garden's been maintained for many years on end, it's probably best that you start with something that's rich in nutritional value, that's available to your plants immediately as soon as it enters the soil. Over the last 5 or 6 years, as we've created the garden here at North Lodge, which surrounds our 325-year-old thatched cottage, I've used large quantities of soil conditioner, which is very basically freshly made garden compost as you would make in your home garden compost bin. It's basically green waste collected from the curbside by the council, which is taken away to a large recycling facility, which I have actually been lucky enough to see behind the scenes of before. The garden waste is piled up in enormous heaps before being placed through a shredder, which reduces the particle size and obviously speeds up the decomposing process. It reaches high temperatures, which cleanses it of unwanted pathogens, bacteria and other spores that are unwelcome in the garden. Garden compost is then produced in as little as 12 weeks before it's placed back through a shredder to make sure the particle size is below 14 millimetres. This basically is exactly what you would produce in your home garden compost bin, but in literally a fraction of the time. I've described this product before to my followers online as being caffeine for plants, that instant sugar hit. So if you have a garden soil that's either particularly heavy, for instance a clay soil which is really struggling to drain, or you have a soil that is particularly poor, maybe it's full of sand and gravel, this kind of product is absolutely perfect for adding very, very quickly available nutritional value to your plants. Only lasting on the soil surface for around 6 to 8 months, this feeds the soil very heavily and is drawn down into the soil structure by soil living creatures such as worms. This kind of product can be used for several seasons. I also use this in the trial beds and across my vegetable and cutting garden as a mulching and soil conditioner. After several years of using this product at a depth of around 4 inches or 10 centimetres all over my garden beds, I was incredibly confident that my soil was in much better condition than it was when I moved into this house nearly 7 years ago. I carried out a quick soil test by simply digging a large hole in the middle of one of my borders and just seeing how much organic matter had been drawn down into the soil structure. Unbelievably, it was light, crumbly and had a beautiful texture. So last year I made the decision to start moving into using a different product. Now I was confident that my plants were being well fed and there was plenty of organic matter already in the soil. I was able to move over to a woodland mulched bark. This is very basically a tree surgeon's byproduct. Removing all pieces from the tree, brush, leaves and stems, everything is chipped up together before heading off to the same recycling facility as I buy my soil conditioner from. They keep it in large heaps for around 8 to 10 weeks, just to allow the leaves and smaller twigs to start breaking down and biodegrading. This has a small amount of immediately available nutritional value available to your soil, but it also has a larger particle size, upwards of between 14 and 20 millimetres in size, meaning it lasts a little bit longer on top of the soil surface and will be still visible after around 12 to 14 months. It also has the ability of sealing in moisture, suppressing the weeds whilst feeding the soil and biodegrading at the same time. After several years of doing this, I'm going to make the move into a woodland bark mulch, which once again has a larger particle size and will stay on top of the soil structure for much longer periods of time. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what you add to your garden soil, as long as you add something. Gardening really has taken a bit of a hit on the organic front over the last few years. Many gardeners growing up with their parents teaching them techniques from the 50s, 60s and 70s, where gardening became very sterile and clinical. People tried to maintain their gardens very much as an extension of their houses, which really they aren't. Realistically, the garden needs to be untidy. It needs to have organic matter in it and piles of it if you are to continue feeding the soil. You can throw as much chemical about as you like, whether it's bloodfish and bone meal, emulsified fish oils, or things like Growmore. But nothing will feed the plants in your garden better than working on the nature and property and condition of your soil. And that's really only done by adding large quantities of organic matter. I get so many comments on my social media channels, especially when I'm reviewing a rose, a dahlia or a peony, about how I managed to get the flowers so big, how my plants look so healthy and how I managed to avoid many of the disease problems that you get in the garden, especially when growing in a confined space. And the answer to that realistically from myself is always exactly the same. Look after your soil and your soil will look after your plants. So don't skip the mulching stage. It's a really nice job to get out into the garden and do, normally in March and April, just as the plants start to wake up. Now obviously you can do this earlier if you're gardening in a much colder climate, allowing the frost and the weather to continue to break down whatever it is that you choose to place onto the surface of the soil. However, here in the UK, especially using a product such as the soil conditioner or a woodland bulk mulch, where the nutritional value is pretty much readily available to your plants, you don't really want to be applying it much before the plants actually need the nutritional value itself. So March, April and the beginning of May are the perfect window of time to get it onto the soil and start sealing in the winter's moisture just before the plants actually need feeding themselves. As I mentioned earlier, I tend to use my backpack blower in the garden to blow the leaves off of the lawn and into the borders. Many people will see this as being lazy, but these are a valuable commodity and represent a really valuable source of nutritional value. I blow them into the borders where they start to compost and decompose over the winter, offering valuable habitat to other creatures such as bumblebees and overwintering wasps. In around March or April, when I come to apply my soil conditioners, I'll make sure that the garden is weed free and then simply mulch over the top of any leaves. They will rot underneath my decorative mulch and continue to add organic matter to the soil. Any overwintering insects can easily find their way out when they're ready. Allowing your garden to be a little bit untidy and to have organic matter sat around in it, whether it's a large pile of decomposing logs in the corner which you call a hedgehog house, or that untidy area where you store the pots behind the greenhouse or shed where the brambles ever so slightly take over. These small areas in the garden are really wonderful and very useful breaks in the garden to give nature that little foothold of places to exist. Adding a homemade or bought bug hotel can really increase the amount of ladybirds that you have overwinter in the garden and alleviate an awful lot of the pest and disease problems that you'll have come April and May next year. I'll be talking a lot more on the subject of organic gardening during season 2 of the Gardener Ben podcast, which will be out and available for you to listen to next February. So for now, from one gardener to another, I implore you to put the secateurs down and just enjoy the season. Allow the garden to shift and the garden to rest for the next few weeks. If you can't wait and you're itching to get out to get the garden to looking a little more tidy and regimented, make sure that you put your garden waste into either a recyclable curbside collection bin or you create your own garden compost or leaf mulch. It's always best if you're planning to make garden compost is you have at least 3 bins available, as it can often take 2 or 3 years to fully biodegrade and create the compost that you're looking to use in the garden. Have your bins lined up one next to each other, and around January time it's best to turn one into the other and work your way down the run. Empty out the one that's 3 years old and use that in other places in the garden. Leaf mulch is really easy to make and simply involves you collecting the leaves from wherever they fall and placing them into large plastic bags. Seal them up and stab them a couple of times with your garden fork and then place them out of sight and out of mind, maybe behind the shed or behind the garage for at least a year to 18 months. After this time, they will have biodegraded into a wonderfully crumbly and very, very useful garden soil conditioner, which you can spread over your garden beds and borders, or even use once screened for potting up seedlings or for planting up larger shrubs and trees. If you haven't done so already, make sure that you head over to one of my social media channels and catch up with all of the bare root rose planting guides that I've posted over the last couple of weeks. Everything from rehydration, storage and planting of bare root roses, whether it's in large containers, in free soil, against a wall or a fence, or even in a container. The tutorials are all available for you to watch now. I'll obviously continue to be posting lots of media over the coming weeks and months, as my schedule simply doesn't stop. But if you're interested in the subject of pruning roses, or you're new to growing roses, don't hesitate to join me for my live pruning tutorials, which will start in around January. If you're in a rush to find out how and to home in on your personal techniques before then, you can catch the videos from last year at any time on YouTube. You'll have to forgive me that this week's episode is a little on the short side, as next week's episode runs on just a little bit. Next week, I have the pleasure in talking to Liam, David Austin Rose's senior rose consultant. I hope you join me next week to listen to that chat, and until then, happy gardening.